Greetings, everyone. This is Live Life Well TV host Robert Landau with another episode of America's Greatest Personalities here on Live Life Well TV. Join me for this episode as we talk about the one and only brilliant comedian, George Carlin. Stay tuned. Here are some of the wonderful things that George Carlin was famous for saying. George Carlin once said, "Here's all you have to know about men and women. Women are crazy, men are stupid. And the main reason women are crazy is that men are stupid." He also once said, "If someone with multiple personalities threatens to kill himself, is it considered a hostage situation?" Carlin also said, "Just because you got the monkey off your back doesn't mean the circus has left town." George also once said, "Isn't it a bit unnerving that doctors call what they do practice?" Or how about this? He once said, "We are a nation of sheep and someone else owns the grass." Or how about this? "I think it's the duty of the comedian to find out where the line is drawn and cross it deliberately." He also once said, and I love this, "Everyone smiles in the same language." His given name was George Dennis Patrick Carlin, and he was born in Manhattan, New York on May 12th, 1937. As many of the comedians that we do talk about in the series, George's childhood didn't have the making of what would be known as a fairy tale. That can often work to an advantage later in a comedian's life because they have plenty of material that they can draw from earlier in their life. When George was 2 months old, his 5-year-old brother and his mother escaped his abusive alcoholic father by climbing down the fire escape of his grandfather's Manhattan apartment. George's mother carried him during this process, carried him down the fire escape. George's uncle also drove them out of the city, and George never would see his father again. So it goes without saying that George and his older brother, Patrick Jr., were raised by their mother, whose name was Mary. George was a bit of a visionary. At only 11 years of age, George had his career path all planned out before any of it actually happened. Carlin would start out as a radio DJ, then parlay that into becoming a stand-up comedian and actor, all planned out when he was only 11 years old. I guess it stands to reason that the saying, "You gotta see it," before it actually becomes reality, is important. Also, you got to believe it before you actually expect it to come to you. George would attend, but unfortunately would end up being expelled from Cardinal Hayes High School in the Bronx, New York, the same alma mater that Regis Philbin and Martin Scorsese came from. George wasn't always at home. Because of his volatile relationship with his mother, George would often run away from home. It was at summer camp in New Hampshire that George would develop an interest in drama and actually won a few awards for plays that he would appear in there. It was also at this time that comedy would become a huge interest of his. Life was not easy for George Carlin, and he found that expressing himself dramatically and humorously was a very healthy, albeit sarcastic, way to deal with his life's often ups and downs. So, who would George have told you was his idol back in the day? To that, he said these words: Danny Kaye was my childhood dream when I was 10 years old. I kind of looked at that and thought, gee, well, I can do that. He makes funny faces, he talks in funny accents, and he can do very, very intricate vocal pieces. But later in George's life, he would say this about Danny Kaye: I collected autographs as a kid, not in any sort of hardcore way, but just by hanging around various stage doors. And I loved Danny Kaye. He was in the stage show at Radio City, and I went and I stood at that door for over an hour. It was a rainy, cold day, and I wasn't in the direct rain, but it was very cold and it was getting dark. And I stood there and waited for Danny Kaye, and he came, and I was the only kid there. And he walked right past me. He wouldn't even say anything. And I did my little rap. Oh, please, 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 sir. And then later I see him with these UNICEF kids, with 30 of them sitting on his lap, and I knew he was full of crap. George would join the United States Air Force as a radar technician, but that probably wasn't the greatest idea. Why? Because during his course of duty, he would be court-martialed no less than 3 times. It was also at this time that he would start working at a radio station as a radio disc jockey in Shreveport, that wasn't too far from where George happened to have been stationed. DJing was something that really, really was a great fit for him. It clicked because he could be himself and also just happened to interject brief comedy routines as well as social commentary while he would be on the air. While he was DJing at a radio station in Fort Worth, George met another DJ there, and the two hit it off. They then formed a comedy act, made an audition tape, and if that wasn't enough, they up and moved to LA. Why would they move to LA? Well, for reasons that you can probably surmise, that was a place that they could really start to get work. They had a morning show eventually on TV, and at night they would do their act in coffee houses to great acclaim, I might add. Things were going very well for the two, but after a heart-to-heart, they eventually decided to part ways as close friends and pursue separate careers. And it was then that George's career would really take off. He would appear in numerous comedy clubs with lines such as, if it's true that our species is alone in the universe, then I'd have to say that the universe aimed rather low and settled for very little. He would also say, I am is reportedly the shortest sentence in the English language. Could it be that I do is the longest sentence? How about this one? The caterpillar does all the work, but the butterfly gets all the publicity. It was during this time that George would be summoned to do his thing on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And as I often say in this series, if you're an up and coming entertainer, singer, particularly a comedian, and you happen to have the great good fortune and good luck to land a little bit of a gig on The Tonight Show when Johnny Carson was there, and you came out in front of that curtain, and he loved your routine. You could hear him laughing in the background, and then when you finished, he would motion for you to come and sit next to him on the panel. Well, you know what? You know by then, and your agent knows by then that you got it made. And overnight, you have the very keen possibility of becoming a household name. And that is just what happened to George Carlin. Suffice it to say that George would end up making numerous appearances on The Tonight Show, many of which you can still see on YouTube, and I would highly, highly recommend you check those clips out. As with many comedians, the routine you'd see George do on shows like The Tonight Show would be vastly different than the routine you'd see him do at a comedy club, for reasons I'm sure you can guess. George became very famous for telling it like it is, curse words and all. In fact, Carlin was present at fellow comedian Lenny Bruce's infamous arrest for obscenity. As the police began attempting to detain members of the audience for questioning, they asked Carlin for his identification, telling the police that he did not believe in government issue IDs. George was immediately arrested and taken to jail with Lenny Bruce, in the same vehicle. Upon release, George would go right back to telling it like he felt it should be, on stage, live, in person, saying things like this. For centuries now, man has done everything he can to destroy, defile, and interfere with nature. Clear cutting forests, strip mining mountains, poisoning the atmosphere, overfishing the oceans, polluting the rivers and lakes, destroying wetlands and aquifers. So when nature strikes back and smacks him on the head, I actually enjoy that. I have absolutely no sympathy for human beings whatsoever. None. And no matter what kind of problems humans happen to be facing, whether it's natural or man-made, I always hope it gets worse. To show you how well Carlin was doing in the 1960s, George was making about $250,000 annually. Back in the 1960s, that was really something. As any performer would, Mr. Carlin would often be insecure about his amazing genius of a talent. Here's an example. Immediately after recording his breakthrough album, 1972's FM and AM in Washington, D.C., George was so convinced that he botched the gig that he spent the entire night wandering the streets in absolute tears. Much to his chagrin, though, the album became a huge hit, even earning him a Grammy Award in the process. George would have been the first one to tell you that he had a lifelong issue with drug addiction. And to that end, here is this. When George was about to be arrested after a stand-up gig in Milwaukee because of an offensive routine, he was especially worried because he had cocaine in his pocket. Luckily, his wife at the time was able to warn him in advance while bringing water to him on the stage. And after his show was done, he quietly handed the drugs to a band that was also playing the event before the police took George away. Despite his famous stage persona as an angry, volatile man, he was really known to be a very kind, quiet, and shy guy off stage. George hosted, you might not know this, but he hosted the very first ever episode of Saturday Night Live. Did you also know that initially Saturday Night Live was trying to arrange for three permanent hosts to work on a rotating basis? And those hosts were Richard Pryor, Lily Tomlin, and George. They couldn't work it out though and went to guest hosts instead, which is the format of the show that we still have to this very day. Did you also know that Carlin would train his own mind after reading a book called Psycho-Cybernetics, which talked about developing the mind as a, quote, goal-seeking and problem-solving machine? In his private life, George was a major romantic. He was married to the same woman for 37 years, believed that being smart is one of the sexiest things, according to him, and also felt that, he used to say this, when you have the kind of idealized romantic love where two personalities are strongly attracted to each other, it makes the sex so much better, unquote. What made George the great comedian that he was? Well, Carlin got into trouble with the IRS for not filing for so many years. He had to stay on the road for extended periods of time because the IRS was taking a major portion of his paycheck that he would make. He would say, the IRS actually made me a way better comedian because I had to stay out on the road and I couldn't pursue a movie career, which would have gone nowhere anyway. And I became a really good comic and writer eventually, saving all my files and thoughts and things. I had to be prepared for that because HBO was coming along, and about every 2 years at my choice, I had to have another hour of material ready. So my having to stay on the road turned me into a darn good comedian. So there's a bright side to everything. The IRS wasn't the only official entity that happened to be after him at the time. The FCC would often be citing Carlin for profanity as well. When it seemed as if Carlin's star couldn't shine any brighter, despite all of that, HBO did come knocking on his door. This would be the start of a very long and happy marriage between the two, as George would give HBO, get this, no less than 14 live comedy specials. What an amazing accomplishment that is. And not only that, but Hollywood knocked on George's door and numerous film roles would follow. George would meet a lady back in August of 1960 by the name of Brenda Hosbrook. They would marry and welcome a child by the name of Kelly in 1963. Unfortunately, though, Brenda would pass of liver cancer in 1997, right before George's 60th birthday, and they were married for all the years that he mentioned before. Carlin would marry once again to a lady by the name of Sally Wade, who was a comedy writer that happened to have been based in Hollywood, and they would marry in 1998. We would lose the great George Carlin on June 2nd, 2008, due to cardiac arrest. George, unfortunately, had had a long history of heart issues and suffered no less than 3 heart attacks and a serious incident of heart failure in 2005. This great man was 71 years of age when he passed, and the tributes are still coming in. Why? Because sometimes thinking off center and being out of the box and speaking what a lot of other people are afraid to say, well, you can make a pretty good career out of doing that. But It's not as easy as it might look. You have to be very careful, even when you're direct. But George Carlin had amazing wit. He understood how to use sarcasm to his advantage to actually make people think and laugh. He would talk about current events. He would talk about things that you really shouldn't talk about, whether it was political or world events or other things of that nature. And you know what? He would talk about some of the not so fun things about flying on commercial airlines. He would often talk about the hazards of watching too much TV. Look at some of those clips on YouTube. Bring George Carlin up on YouTube, for example, and you will find some of the most wonderful, amazing, ingenious comic routines ever. At least that's my personal opinion. I truly appreciate people like George Carlin, and I'm very thankful for people like George Carlin. Why? Because they're not afraid to tell it like it is. And so many of the things that I'm thinking, he actually dares to say. But the way he twists those and presents them, it's just a wonderful way to look at some of the things we're afraid to look at in our world today. I say world today because even though George Carlin is no longer with us, everything that he said back then is still so very relevant to this day. And that is one of the many things that makes George Carlin a great American personality. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this episode. This has been Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host. We'll see you on the next episode. Until then, God bless.